It's one of the strangest mysteries in our planet's story. The Earth, this 4.5 billion-year-old rock spinning through space, has kept an incredible record of its history written in stone, layer upon layer of sedimentary rock, each one a page in the greatest book ever written. The story of volcanoes and seas, of creatures that lived and died, of ice ages and warm periods, all preserved in exquisite detail. But here's the thing. Right in the middle of this story, there's a chapter missing. Not just any chapter, an entire volume, more than 1 billion years of Earth's history, just gone, vanished, as if someone took a cosmic eraser and wiped away 1/5 of our planet's entire existence. If you use these to fall asleep, that's the point, so subscribe maybe. Tell me where you are and what time. Someone from Lisbon said 2 a.m. and someone from Lincoln said 8 p.m. Math checks out but still feels weird. This isn't some small gap we're talking about. This is a hole in time so vast, so incomprehensible that it makes the extinction of the dinosaurs look like a footnote. We're talking about a missing chunk of history longer than the entire time complex life has existed on Earth, longer than it took for single-celled organisms to evolve into every plant and animal you've ever seen. 1 billion years, just gone. The story begins on a scorching August day in 1869. The American Civil War was over, the Transcontinental Railroad had just been completed, and somewhere in the depths of an unexplored canyon in the American Southwest, a one-armed geology professor named John Wesley Powell was about to stumble onto one of the greatest mysteries in the history of science. Powell wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be in Illinois, teaching geology to students who probably couldn't have cared less about rocks and minerals. But Powell was different. He'd lost his right arm to a Confederate mini-ball at the Battle of Shiloh, but that hadn't stopped him from becoming obsessed with the American West. He'd organised his own expedition, scraping together funding and volunteers for what everyone said was a suicide mission. The goal was simple. Follow the Green and Colorado rivers wherever they led, mapping the geology along the way. The problem was that no one knew where those rivers led. The entire Colorado Plateau was blank on every map, unexplored, unknown. 10 men in 4 wooden boats. That's all Powell had. No GPS, no satellite phones, no rescue teams standing by. Just 10 men, 3 months of supplies, and a dream of filling in the last blank space on the American map. What they found would change everything we thought we knew about our planet's past. As Powell and his ragged crew floated deeper into what would later be called the Grand Canyon, he noticed something odd. The rock layers weren't just beautiful, they were telling a story, and like any good geologist, Powell knew how to read that story. Older rocks at the bottom, younger rocks at the top, each layer representing millions of years of Earth's history, stacked like pages in a book. But then he saw something that stopped him cold. There, exposed in the canyon walls like a scar across the face of time itself, was a line, a perfectly horizontal line where 2 completely different types of rock met. Below the line, ancient crystalline rocks twisted and folded by unimaginable forces, dark and mysterious. Above the line, neat horizontal layers of sedimentary rock, looking almost modern by comparison. Powell was staring at what geologists call an unconformity, a gap in the geological record where older rocks meet younger rocks with nothing in between. Unconformities happen all the time in geology. Rivers erode away sediments, glaciers scrape off layers of rock. Mountains get weathered down to nothing. But this unconformity was different. This one was massive. Powell did the math, and the numbers made no sense. The rocks below the line were ancient beyond imagination, some of them dating back over 1.5 billion years. The rocks above the line were much younger, around 500 million years old. That meant there was a gap of more than 1 billion years right there in front of him. 1 billion years of missing time where there should have been layer after layer of rock telling the story of what happened to Earth during that vast stretch of prehistory. It was as if someone had taken a knife and cut out 1,000 million years from the middle of Earth's autobiography. Powell named it the Great Unconformity, and the more he studied it, the more mysterious it became. This wasn't just some local phenomenon. As geologists began exploring other parts of the world, they found the same thing, the same gap in time, the same missing billion years in Scotland, in Canada, in Australia. Everywhere they looked, they found evidence of this massive hole in Earth's memory. But how do you lose 1 billion years? What could possibly erase that much of Earth's history? The first clue came from understanding what those missing years represented. We're talking about the late Precambrian era, a time when Earth was undergoing some of the most dramatic changes in its entire history. This was when the first complex cells evolved, when oxygen began building up in the atmosphere, when life itself was taking its first tentative steps toward complexity, and all of that history, all of those crucial evolutionary developments were somehow missing from the rock record. It was like trying to understand the rise of human civilization, but having every book, every scroll, every piece of written history from the dawn of agriculture to the Renaissance just disappear. You'd have cave paintings on one side and Shakespeare on the other, with nothing in between to explain how we got from one to the other. For over a century, geologists have been trying to solve this puzzle. What happened to those missing years? Where did all that rock go? Was it erosion, volcanic activity, some kind of catastrophic global event? The theories have come and gone, each one trying to explain how you make 1 billion years of Earth's history simply vanish. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because as it turns out, the Great Unconformity isn't just about missing rock, it's about missing time at one of the most crucial periods in Earth's history. The billion years that disappeared coincide almost exactly with one of the most dramatic climate events our planet has ever experienced. A time when Earth became a frozen wasteland covered in ice from pole to pole. A time scientists call Snowball Earth. Picture this. 700 million years ago, Earth looked nothing like the blue marble we know today. Instead, imagine a white ball hanging in space, its entire surface covered in ice up to 1 kilometer thick, the oceans frozen solid, the continents buried under glaciers that made the current Antarctic ice sheet look like a puddle. Temperatures so cold that even at the equator, where it should have been tropical, the ice never melted. This wasn't just any ice age. This was the ice age to end all ice ages, a planetary deep freeze that lasted for tens of millions of years, and it happened right in the middle of those missing billion years. Could Snowball Earth be the answer? Could those massive glaciers have scraped away an entire eon's worth of rock, grinding it to dust and washing it into the oceans? It would explain the timing. It would explain the global nature of the Great Unconformity. It would explain how you could lose 1 billion years of geological history all at once. For decades, this was the leading theory. Snowball Earth glaciers had essentially sandpapered the entire planet, removing layer after layer of rock and leaving behind the Great Unconformity as a scar. It was elegant, it was simple, it explained everything. There was just one problem. It was probably wrong. The first crack in the Snowball Earth theory came from an unexpected place, not from glaciers or ice ages, but from the deep, hot interior of our planet, from plate tectonics and the slow, inexorable dance of the continents as they drift across Earth's surface. From the realization that 700 million years ago, Earth's land masses weren't scattered across the globe like they are today. Instead, they were jammed together in a massive supercontinent called Rodinia. Rodinia was unlike anything that exists on Earth today. Imagine taking every continent, every landmass, every island and squashing them together into one enormous landmass surrounded by a single vast ocean. That was Rodinia, a supercontinent so large that it would take months to walk from one coast to another, so massive that it changed the very climate of our planet. But supercontinents don't last forever. They come together, they stay together for a few 100 million years, and then they rip apart in a process so violent it makes the largest earthquakes in recorded history look like tremors. And around 750 million years ago, right in the middle of those missing billion years, Rodinia began to tear itself apart. What happens when a supercontinent breaks up? It's not like tearing a piece of paper. It's more like tearing apart a massive jigsaw puzzle made of rock that's been fused together by unimaginable heat and pressure. The process generates forces so enormous they can lift entire mountain ranges and then tear them down again. They can create rifts thousands of kilometers long that eventually become oceans. They can generate volcanic eruptions that dwarf anything in recorded history. And they can expose vast areas of ancient rock to erosion for the first time in hundreds of millions of years. As Rodinia ripped apart, massive chunks of the ancient supercontinent were thrust upward, creating mountain ranges that would have made the Himalayas look like hills. But mountains don't last forever. Once they're exposed to the elements, erosion begins its relentless work. Rain, wind, ice and rivers slowly wear them down, grain by grain, carrying the debris away to be deposited in distant oceans. The breakup of Rodinia would have created perfect conditions for massive erosion on a scale never seen before or since. Freshly exposed rock faces stretching for thousands of kilometers. No vegetation to hold the soil in place because complex land plants hadn't evolved yet. Climate chaos as the arrangement of continents and oceans completely changed. And hundreds of millions of years for erosion to do its work. Could the breakup of Rodinia explain the great unconformity? Could the tearing apart of this ancient supercontinent have carved away 1 billion years of Earth's history? The timing was perfect, the scale was right, and it would explain why the great unconformity appears all over the world, but not in exactly the same way everywhere. But there was still a problem. How do you prove something that happened 750 million years ago? How do you find evidence of erosion that removed the very rocks that would contain that evidence? The answer came from an unlikely source, from tiny crystals of a mineral called zircon, hidden deep within the rocks that survived the great unconformity. Zircon is like a geological time capsule. It's incredibly durable, resistant to heat and pressure and chemical weathering, and it contains trace amounts of uranium that decay into lead at a precisely known rate, making it a perfect geological clock. But zircon can tell us more than just the age of rocks. It can tell us about temperature. As zircon cools down from the high temperatures deep in Earth's crust, it traps helium atoms in its crystal structure. By measuring how much helium has leaked out of zircon crystals over millions of years, scientists can determine when those crystals cooled down and how fast. This technique, called thermochronology, is like reading the thermal history of rocks. It can tell you when a piece of rock that was once buried deep in the Earth's crust was brought close to the surface where temperatures are cooler. In other words, it can tell you when erosion stripped away the layers of rock above it. When scientists applied thermochronology to rocks from the great unconformity around the world, they found something remarkable. The rocks all showed evidence of rapid cooling right around the time when Rodinia was breaking apart, as if massive amounts of overlying rock had been suddenly stripped away, exposing the ancient rocks beneath to the cooler temperatures near Earth's surface. The evidence was pointing toward a conclusion that would have been unthinkable just a few decades earlier. The Great Unconformity, this massive hole in Earth's memory, wasn't caused by Ice Age glaciers scraping away the rock. It was caused by the catastrophic breakup of a supercontinent that existed when our planet was young and alien and utterly unlike the world we know today. But this revelation raised even bigger questions. If the breakup of Rodinia created the Great Unconformity, what else might it have caused? What were the consequences of erasing 1 billion years of Earth's history? And what does this tell us about the hidden forces that shape our planet over geological time? The answers would turn out to be even more extraordinary than anyone had imagined. The consequences began with the climate. When a supercontinent the size of Rodinia suddenly starts tearing itself apart, it doesn't just change the geology of a planet, it changes everything. Ocean currents that had flowed in the same patterns for hundreds of millions of years suddenly find their paths blocked by new mountain ranges or opened by new rifts. Weather patterns that had remained stable for eons suddenly shift as continents drift into new positions. The very chemistry of the oceans changes as massive volcanic eruptions pump unprecedented amounts of gases into the atmosphere. But the most dramatic consequence was cold, unimaginably, catastrophically cold. The story of Earth's frozen period began in the 1980s when a brilliant but quirky geologist named Joe Kirschvink was studying some very old rocks in Australia. These weren't just any old rocks, they were rocks that contained tiny magnetic crystals, frozen in time like compass needles pointing in the direction of Earth's ancient magnetic field. By studying these magnetic signatures, Kirschvink could determine where on Earth these rocks had formed hundreds of millions of years ago. What he found made no sense. The rocks showed clear evidence of glacial activity, scratches and gouges left by massive ice sheets, boulders dropped in the middle of what should have been tropical seas, the unmistakable signatures of glaciers and icebergs. But according to the magnetic evidence, these rocks had formed near the equator, in the hottest, most tropical part of the planet. How do you get glaciers at the equator? Kirschvink realized there was only one answer that made sense. The glaciers weren't just at the equator, they were everywhere. The entire planet had been covered in ice from pole to pole, creating what he called snowball Earth. The idea was so radical it was almost laughable. A completely frozen planet, ice covering the oceans from surface to seabed, glaciers stretching from Alaska to Australia. It sounded like science fiction, but the evidence kept mounting. Glacial deposits found in what had been tropical zones. Strange rock formations that could only be explained by ice sheets thousands of meters thick. Chemical signatures in ancient rocks that pointed to oceans sealed under kilometers of ice. And the timing was perfect. The snowball Earth glaciations happened between 700 and 600 million years ago, right in the middle of those missing billion years, right when the Great Unconformity was being carved. The theory gained momentum throughout the 90s and 2000s as more evidence piled up. Geologists found glacial deposits on every continent. They found evidence that the oceans had become completely cut off from the atmosphere, sealed under a global ice cap. They found chemical signatures that suggested the entire planet had plunged into a deep freeze that lasted for tens of millions of years. It was the perfect explanation for the Great Unconformity. When ice sheets kilometers thick covered every continent, they would have scraped and ground and pulverized everything in their path. Ancient mountains would have been worn down to nothing. Billions of tons of rock would have been ground into powder and carried away by glacial rivers. Over millions of years of grinding and scraping, entire geological eras could have been simply erased. The snowball Earth theory explained everything. The global nature of the great unconformity, the timing, the sheer scale of the missing rock. It was elegant and dramatic, and it made perfect scientific sense. There was just one small problem. The more closely scientists looked at snowball Earth, the more they realized it might not have been quite as simple as a completely frozen planet scraping away billions of years of geological history. The first doubts came from computer climate models. When scientists tried to simulate what would happen if Earth really did freeze over completely, they ran into a problem. Once the planet was covered in ice, it should have stayed that way forever. Ice reflects sunlight back into space instead of absorbing it. The more ice you have, the colder it gets. The colder it gets, the more ice you get. It's a runaway process that should have turned Earth into a permanent snowball, leaving us as a frozen wasteland drifting through space. But Earth obviously didn't stay frozen. Something broke the ice. Something warmed the planet up enough to melt the glaciers and restore the oceans. The most likely explanation was volcanoes. Even during the deepest freeze, volcanic eruptions would have continued pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. With the oceans sealed under ice, there would have been no way for natural processes to remove that carbon dioxide from the air. Over millions of years, it would have built up to levels that created a super greenhouse effect, eventually warming the planet enough to break the ice. But when scientists calculated how long this would take, they ran into another problem. It should have taken at least 10 million years for volcanic carbon dioxide to build up enough to end a snowball Earth event. Yet the geological evidence suggested that some of these glaciations ended much more quickly, possibly in just a few 100,000 years. Then there were the drop stones. These were boulders found in ancient ocean sediments, apparently dropped there by melting icebergs. But some of these drop stones were found in layers that supposedly represented the height of snowball Earth glaciation, when the ocean should have been completely frozen. How do you get icebergs in a completely frozen ocean? The more evidence geologists examined, the more complicated the picture became. Maybe Earth hadn't frozen completely. Maybe there were pockets of open ocean, even at the height of the glaciation. Maybe the ice advanced and retreated multiple times, creating a complex pattern of freezing and melting rather than a simple global deep freeze. And maybe, just maybe, snowball Earth wasn't responsible for the great unconformity after all. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction, not from studying ice or glaciers, but from studying heat, specifically the thermal history of rocks using those tiny zircon crystals and their trapped helium atoms. When geologists applied thermochronology to rocks from different parts of the world, they found something that didn't fit the snowball Earth model. The cooling events that created the great unconformity hadn't happened all at the same time. Instead, they had happened in waves, spread out over hundreds of millions of years. Some areas showed evidence of massive erosion starting as early as 1 billion years ago. Others showed the main erosion event happening around 700 million years ago. Still others showed it happening as late as 500 million years ago. If snowball Earth glaciers had scraped away all the missing rock, you'd expect to see evidence of erosion happening at the same time everywhere, but that's not what the rocks were showing. Instead, they showed a complex pattern of erosion events happening at different times in different places, as if some massive long-term process was slowly carving away the missing billion years piece by piece. The process wasn't glaciation. It was something even more powerful and long-lasting. It was the birth and death of mountain ranges on a scale that dwarfed anything that exists on Earth today. When supercontinents form, they don't just mash together like pieces of clay, they collide with tremendous force, creating mountain ranges that can stretch for thousands of kilometers and rise to heights that make the current Himalayas look like foothills. The Grenville Mountains, formed during Rodinia's assembly, may have been the largest mountain range in Earth's history, stretching from what is now Mexico to Scandinavia. But when supercontinents break apart, those massive mountain ranges become targets for erosion on an unprecedented scale. The breakup process itself creates enormous uplifts and rifts, exposing vast amounts of ancient rock to weathering for the first time in hundreds of millions of years. And because this was happening before land plants had evolved, there was nothing to hold the soil together. No roots to prevent erosion, no vegetation to slow down the relentless work of wind and rain. Imagine mountain ranges the size of the Rockies, the Alps and the Himalayas combined, with no trees, no grass, no moss, nothing green at all to protect them from the elements, just bare rock exposed to hundreds of millions of years of rain and wind and temperature changes. The erosion would have been catastrophic. As Rodinia tore apart, it created perfect storm conditions for erosion. Massive uplifts exposed billions of tons of ancient rock to weathering. New rift valleys provided pathways for water to carry away the eroded debris. Changing climate patterns caused by the shifting positions of continents and oceans may have created more intense storms and more dramatic temperature swings. And it wasn't just happening in one place. As the supercontinent broke apart, different pieces were uplifted and eroded at different times, creating the complex pattern of cooling events that geologists were finding in the thermochronology data. First, one region would be uplifted and stripped of its overlying rock layers, then another, then another. Over hundreds of millions of years, vast areas of Rodinia were essentially skinned, with kilometers of rock being worn away and washed into the oceans. But there was more to the story than just mechanical erosion. The breakup of Rodinia also triggered massive chemical changes in the ocean and atmosphere that may have accelerated the erosion process in unexpected ways. When supercontinents break apart, they don't just create new mountain ranges, they also create massive volcanic eruptions as hot magma wells up from the Earth's interior to fill the cracks. These eruptions pump enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, changing the chemistry of rain and making it more acidic. Acidic rain is much more effective at dissolving rock than normal rain, accelerating the chemical weathering process. At the same time, the breakup process exposes vast amounts of fresh rock to chemical weathering for the first time. When certain types of rock, particularly those rich in minerals like feldspar and olivine, are exposed to water and carbon dioxide, they undergo chemical reactions that consume atmospheric carbon dioxide. On the scale of a breaking supercontinent, this process can remove enormous amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere means a cooler climate. A cooler climate means more ice formation. More ice means more physical erosion as glaciers scrape and grind their way across the landscape. It's a feedback loop that could have dramatically accelerated the erosion process. The result was a planet-wide erosion event unlike anything in Earth's history, not just glaciers scraping away rock, but a complex interplay of tectonic forces, volcanic activity, climate change, and chemical weathering all working together to carve away hundreds of millions of years of geological history. Different parts of the former supercontinent were affected at different times and in different ways, creating the complex pattern of missing rock that we see in the Great Unconformity today. Some areas were uplifted and eroded early in the breakup process. Others remained buried under sediment for millions of years before finally being exposed to erosion. Still others experienced multiple cycles of burial and erosion as the complex dance of continental breakup played out over geological time. The scale was almost incomprehensible. Entire mountain ranges, some of them larger than any that exist today, were worn down to nothing. Billions of cubic kilometers of rock were ground up and washed into the oceans. Geological formations that had taken hundreds of millions of years to form were erased in what was, by geological standards, the blink of an eye. And when it was over, when the breakup of Rodinia was complete and the fragments had drifted apart to begin forming new continents and new oceans, what was left behind was a scar across the face of time itself, a gap in Earth's memory where 1 billion years of history should have been. But the story doesn't end with erosion and missing rock, because the breakup of Rodinia and the creation of the Great Unconformity had consequences that reached far beyond geology. They may have changed the very course of life on Earth, setting the stage for one of the most important evolutionary events in our planet's history. The consequences were just beginning to unfold. Those consequences began with life itself. To understand what the breakup of Rodinia meant for the evolution of life on Earth, you have to picture what our planet looked like 750 million years ago. It was an alien world. The sky was a different colour because there was less oxygen in the atmosphere. The continents were barren wastelands of naked rock because plants hadn't yet learned how to live on land. The oceans teemed with microscopic life, but most of it was single-celled bacteria and algae floating in vast, empty seas. Complex life as we know it simply didn't exist yet. No fish, no coral reefs, no jellyfish, no worms, nothing with eyes or brains or hearts or blood. The most sophisticated organisms on the planet were barely visible to the naked eye. Earth had been inhabited by living things for over 3 billion years. But for most of that time, life had remained stubbornly, maddeningly simple. Then Rodinia began to tear apart, and everything changed. The first clue that something extraordinary was happening came from rocks in South Australia's Flinders Ranges, where a geologist named Reginald Sprigg was studying what he thought were ancient worm burrows. The year was 1946, and Sprigg was working for the South Australian government, mapping mineral deposits in the remote outback. What he found instead would revolutionise our understanding of early life on Earth. The rocks weren't just old, they were from the Ediacaran period, the time immediately after the most severe snowball Earth glaciation had ended, and they contained fossils unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. These weren't the familiar shells and skeletons of later periods. These were impressions of soft-bodied creatures that looked like nothing that had ever lived before or since. Frond-like organisms that might have been plants or animals or something in between. Disc-shaped creatures with radial symmetry, bizarre quilted forms that some scientists thought might represent an entirely different experiment in multicellular life. The Ediacaran fauna, as it came to be known, was the first clear evidence of complex multicellular life on Earth, and it appeared right after the breakup of Rodinia, right after the formation of the Great Unconformity, right when Earth was emerging from the most severe ice age in its history. The timing couldn't have been a coincidence. As Rodinia broke apart and scattered its fragments across the globe, it created something that had never existed before in Earth's history: shallow seas. When all the continents are jammed together in a single supercontinent, most of the ocean is one enormous deep basin. There are very few continental shelves, very few coastal areas where sunlight can penetrate to the sea floor. But when continents break apart and spread out, they create vast areas of shallow water along their margins. Shallow seas are biological gold mines. They're where sunlight reaches the bottom, where nutrients from rivers mix with seawater, where complex ecosystems can develop. The breakup of Rodinia created millions of square kilometers of new shallow marine habitat, providing evolutionary opportunities that had never existed before. But it did more than just create new habitats. It fundamentally changed the chemistry of the ocean in ways that made complex life possible for the first time. The massive erosion that created the Great Unconformity didn't just remove rock, it also released enormous quantities of nutrients into the ocean. Phosphorus, nitrogen, iron, and other elements essential for life were suddenly available in concentrations far higher than ever before. The eroding mountains of Rodinia became a gigantic fertilizer factory, pumping nutrients into the seas on a scale that dwarfed anything in the modern world. At the same time, the breakup process was changing the ocean's circulation patterns. With continents spread out instead of clustered together, ocean currents could flow more freely, distributing oxygen and nutrients more efficiently. Areas of the ocean that had been stagnant and oxygen poor for hundreds of millions of years suddenly became well oxygenated and habitable. The stage was set for an evolutionary explosion, and around 540 million years ago, that's exactly what happened. The Cambrian explosion is one of the most famous events in evolutionary history, but it's also one of the most mysterious. In a span of just 20 million years, life on Earth went from simple, soft-bodied organisms to a dazzling array of complex animals with shells, eyes, guts, brains, and sophisticated behaviors. Trilobites with compound eyes that could detect polarized light. Anomalocaris, a 2-meter-long predator with grasping arms and a circular mouth full of teeth. Waiwaxia, covered in spines and scales like some alien pincushion. It was as if evolution had been stuck in first gear for 3 billion years and then suddenly shifted into overdrive. Charles Darwin called it an abominable mystery. How could evolution work so quickly? Where did all these new forms come from? Why did it happen when it did? The fossil records seem to show complex life appearing out of nowhere, with no clear evolutionary precursors. But now we know the answer. The Cambrian explosion didn't happen out of nowhere. It was the result of the breakup of Rodinia, the formation of the Great Unconformity, and the complete transformation of Earth's surface environment. The missing billion years weren't just missing from the rock record. They were a period of preparation, setting the stage for the most important evolutionary event in the history of complex life. The evidence for this connection comes from multiple lines of research, but some of the most compelling comes from studying the rocks themselves. When geologists analyze the chemical composition of rocks from before and after the Great Unconformity, they find dramatic differences that tell the story of a planet in transition. Before the breakup of Rodinia, the rocks show evidence of a world with very little oxygen in the atmosphere or oceans. Most of the planet's iron was dissolved in seawater, giving the oceans a greenish colour very different from today's blue. Sulfur compounds dominated the chemistry of many marine environments, creating conditions that would be toxic to most modern life forms. But after the Great Unconformity, everything changed. Oxygen levels skyrocketed, iron became oxidized and precipitated out of the oceans, creating the distinctive red rocks that geologists call banded iron formations. The ocean chemistry shifted from sulfur-dominated to oxygen-dominated, creating conditions that could support complex animal life for the first time. This wasn't just a gradual change, it was a transformation so rapid and dramatic that geologists call it the Great Oxidation Event, and it coincided almost exactly with the formation of the Great Unconformity. The connection isn't accidental. The massive erosion that carved the Great Unconformity exposed enormous amounts of fresh rock to weathering, and when certain types of rock weather, they consume atmospheric carbon dioxide and release oxygen. On the scale of a breaking supercontinent, this process can dramatically change the composition of the atmosphere. At the same time, the increased nutrient levels in the ocean caused by all that erosion fueled massive blooms of photosynthetic bacteria and algae. These organisms consume carbon dioxide and produce oxygen, further changing the atmospheric composition. The breakup of Rodinia created a positive feedback loop that pumped more and more oxygen into the atmosphere until it reached levels that could support complex animal life. But the story gets even more remarkable when you realise that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The Great Unconformity wasn't just a one-time event, it was part of a pattern that has repeated throughout Earth's history, linked to the cycle of supercontinent formation and breakup. Every time a supercontinent forms and then breaks apart, it creates conditions for massive erosion and environmental change. The breakup of Columbia, an even earlier supercontinent that existed around 1.5 billion years ago, may have triggered the first rise in atmospheric oxygen levels. The formation and breakup of Pangaea, much more recently, coincided with massive extinction events and evolutionary changes. It's as if Earth has a geological heartbeat, with supercontinents forming and breaking apart every few 100 million years, each cycle reshaping the planet's surface and creating new opportunities for life to evolve and diversify. The evidence for this pattern comes from studying great unconformities around the world, and what scientists have found is that Powell's discovery in the Grand Canyon wasn't unique. There are unconformities of similar age and scale on every continent, each one telling the same story of massive erosion and missing time. In Scotland's Highlands, you can put your hand on rocks that are nearly 3 billion years old, covered directly by rocks that are only 500 million years old. In Australia's Flinders Ranges, the same gap spans the landscape like a geological highway. In South Africa's Kapval Craton, in Canada's Shield Country, in China's ancient mountains, the story is always the same. 1 billion years of missing time, carved away by forces almost too large to comprehend. But here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. Recent research using advanced thermochronology techniques has revealed that these great unconformities around the world didn't all form at exactly the same time. Instead, they show a complex pattern of erosion events that matches exactly what you'd expect from the gradual breakup of a supercontinent. Scientists can now trace the breakup of Rodinia in exquisite detail by studying the thermal history of rocks from different continents. They can see how different parts of the supercontinent were uplifted and eroded at different times as the breakup process unfolded over hundreds of millions of years. The western margin of North America shows evidence of massive erosion starting around 750 million years ago, coinciding with the initial rifting events that began to tear Rodinia apart. The eastern margin shows later erosion events, around 600 million years ago when the final pieces of the supercontinent separated. Australia and Antarctica show their own timing, reflecting their position in the breakup sequence. It's like having a geological movie of the most important erosion event in Earth's history, played out over hundreds of millions of years and preserved in the thermal memory of tiny zircon crystals. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery has come from studying not just when the erosion happened, but how much rock was removed. Using a combination of thermochronology and other geological techniques, scientists have been able to estimate the total amount of material that was eroded away during the formation of the Great Unconformity. The The numbers are staggering. In some areas, up to 8 vertical kilometers of rock were stripped away. That's 8,000 meters of geological history gone. To put that in perspective, if you took all the rock that was eroded from just the North American portion of the Great Unconformity and piled it up, it would create a mountain range larger than the Himalayas. And that's just North America. When you add up the erosion from all the continents, the total amount of rock removed during the formation of the Great Unconformity represents one of the largest mass transfer events in Earth's history. Billions of cubic kilometers of continental crust ground up and washed into the oceans, changing not just the geology of the continents, but the chemistry of the sea. The implications are mind-boggling. The Great Unconformity represents not just missing time, but missing volume on a scale that challenges our understanding of how Earth's surface processes work. It suggests that geological forces can operate on scales far larger than anything we see in the modern world. And it raises a troubling question. If something like the Great Unconformity could happen once, could it happen again? Could Earth's geological processes someday carve away another billion years of history, erasing not just rocks, but the entire record of human civilization? The answer lies in understanding what made the breakup of Rodinia so special, and whether the conditions that created the Great Unconformity could ever be repeated. But to understand that, we need to look beyond just the rocks and examine what the Great Unconformity tells us about the fundamental forces that shape our planet over geological time. Because the Great Unconformity isn't just about missing rocks or missing time, it's about the hidden connections between geology and biology, between the solid Earth and the living world, between the deep past and the uncertain future. It's about understanding that Earth is not just a rock floating in space, but a dynamic, integrated system where changes in one part can trigger cascading effects that reshape the entire planet. Those final chapters began with a discovery in the most unlikely place imaginable, not in a famous geological formation or a prestigious university laboratory, but in a parking lot in downtown Denver, Colorado. The year was 2010, and Rebecca Flowers, a young geologist at the University of Colorado, was walking across the asphalt when she noticed something odd about the building foundation next to her car. The concrete was embedded with pieces of local stone, and one particular chunk caught her eye. It looked like granite, but there was something unusual about its texture and mineral composition. Flowers collected a sample and took it back to her lab for analysis. What she found would revolutionize our understanding of how widespread the Great Unconformity really was. The granite contained zircon crystals with a thermal history that told an extraordinary story. This rock, sitting in a parking lot in the middle of a modern city, contained evidence of massive erosion that had happened over 1 billion years ago. The same erosion event that had carved the Great Unconformity and the Grand Canyon had also affected the ancient rocks beneath Denver. It was the first clear evidence that the Great Unconformity extended far beyond the famous exposures that geologists had been studying for decades. The missing billion years wasn't just a local phenomenon affecting ancient mountain ranges and canyon walls. It was a continental-scale event that had reshaped vast areas of North America. Flowers and her colleagues began collecting rock samples from across the American West, from Montana to New Mexico, from California to Texas. Everywhere they looked, they found the same thermal signature, the same evidence of rapid cooling around 700 million years ago. The same story of massive amounts of overlying rock being suddenly stripped away. But the real breakthrough came when they expanded their search to other continents. Working with international colleagues, they began analysing rocks from Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia, and everywhere they looked they found evidence of the same event, the same missing billion years, the same massive erosion, the same thermal signature preserved in tiny zircon crystals. The Great Unconformity wasn't just an American phenomenon, it was global. In Scotland's ancient highlands, where some of the oldest rocks in Europe are exposed, the story was the same. Basement rocks nearly 3 billion years old, overlain directly by much younger sediments, with hundreds of millions of years missing in between. In South Africa's Kapvaal Craton, one of the most stable pieces of continental crust on Earth, the same gaps stretched across hundreds of kilometres. In Australia's Pilbara region, in Canada's Shield Country, in Brazil's ancient interior, the pattern repeated itself again and again. But it wasn't just that the Great Unconformity was found everywhere. It was that the timing and magnitude of the erosion varied from place to place in exactly the way you'd expect if a single, massive supercontinent had broken apart over hundreds of millions of years. The western edges of continents, which had been on the margins of Rodinia, showed evidence of early erosion starting around 800 million years ago. The central parts of continents, which had been in the interior of the supercontinent, showed later erosion events around 600 to 500 million years ago. It was like watching a slow-motion explosion, with pieces of the supercontinent being blasted away in all directions over geological time. The pattern was so consistent that geologists could use it to reconstruct how Rodinia had been assembled and how it had broken apart. They could identify which pieces of modern continents had been connected in the ancient supercontinent by matching their thermal histories. They could trace the propagation of rifts and fractures as they spread across the supercontinent during its breakup. It was geological forensics on a planetary scale, using the Great Unconformity as evidence to solve a crime that had happened 750 million years ago, but the investigation revealed something even more extraordinary. The Great Unconformity wasn't unique in Earth's history, it was just the most recent and best preserved example of a phenomenon that had happened multiple times before. As geologists began studying older rocks with the same thermochronology techniques, they found evidence of earlier unconformities associated with the formation and breakup of even more ancient supercontinents. The breakup of Columbia around 1.5 billion years ago had created its own set of massive erosion events. The assembly of Rodinia itself, around 1 billion years ago, had triggered mountain building and subsequent erosion on a continental scale. Earth's geological history began to look less like a steady accumulation of rock layers and more like a series of catastrophic events, each one capable of reshaping entire continents and erasing hundreds of millions of years of geological history. The implications were staggering. If major unconformities were associated with every supercontinent cycle, then huge chunks of Earth's history were missing from the rock record. The Great Unconformity represented just the most recent gap in a geological record that was far more incomplete than anyone had realized. It was like discovering that most of the pages had been torn out of Earth's autobiography, leaving only fragments of the story scattered across different continents and different time periods. But the story became even more complex when geologists began to realize that not all parts of the Great Unconformity were created equal. The amount of missing time, the timing of the erosion events, and even the types of rocks that were preserved or destroyed varied dramatically from place to place. In some areas, like the Grand Canyon, the unconformity represented a gap of over 1 billion years. In others, the gap was much smaller, only a few 100 million years. In a few locations, there was no gap at all, with continuous rock sequences spanning the entire time period that was missing elsewhere. These variations weren't random. They reflected the complex three-dimensional structure of the ancient continent and the way different parts responded to the forces unleashed during Rodinia's breakup. Areas that were uplifted early in the process lost more rock to erosion. Areas that remained buried under sediment were protected from erosion and retained more of their geological history. It was like studying the aftermath of a massive explosion where some areas were completely devastated while others, just a few kilometers away, remained relatively untouched. The detailed mapping of these variations has revealed new insights into how continents respond to the enormous forces generated during supercontinent breakup. It's shown that continental crust isn't just a passive victim of erosion, but an active participant in the process, with different types of rock responding differently to the stresses and strains of tectonic upheaval. Some rock types, like the ancient gneisses and granites that form the cores of continents, are remarkably resistant to erosion and can survive even the most intense weathering events. Others, like sedimentary rocks and certain types of volcanic formations, are much more vulnerable and can be stripped away relatively quickly. This has profound implications for understanding the long-term evolution of continents. It suggests that the cores of continents, the ancient cratons that have remained stable for billions of years, may have survived precisely because they were more resistant to the kind of massive erosion events that created the Great Unconformity. But it also raises troubling questions about the completeness of the geological record. If erosion events like the Great Unconformity can remove such vast amounts of rock, how much of Earth's history has been permanently lost? How many important evolutionary events, climate changes, or geological processes have left no trace in the rock? Simply because the rocks that recorded them were ground up and washed away billions of years ago? The answer is probably more than we'd like to think. Recent estimates suggest that the Great Unconformity alone represents the erosion of enough rock to cover the entire continental United States to a depth of several kilometers. When you add up all the erosion events associated with all the supercontinent cycles throughout Earth's history, the total amount of missing crustal material becomes almost incomprehensible. We're not just missing 1 billion years from the late Precambrian, we're missing huge chunks of Earth's history from multiple time periods, creating a geological record that is far more fragmented and incomplete than most people realize. This has led some geologists to propose that we need to fundamentally rethink how we interpret Earth's history. Instead of viewing the rock record as a relatively complete archive of past events, we need to recognize it as a highly edited version with huge gaps and missing chapters that may never be recovered. But there's also a more optimistic way to look at the Great Unconformity and its global implications. While it represents a massive loss of geological information, it also provides a unique window into Earth's most extreme processes. It shows us what happens when the planet's internal forces reach their maximum intensity, when continents are torn apart and reassembled on timescales that dwarf human experience. The Great Unconformity is evidence that Earth is capable of far more dramatic changes than anything recorded in human history. It shows that what we think of as permanent features of our planet's surface, like mountain ranges and continents, are actually temporary features on geological timescales, subject to forces that can reshape them beyond recognition. This perspective has important implications for understanding current global change. While human activities are certainly altering Earth's surface and climate in unprecedented ways, the Great Unconformity reminds us that our planet has experienced even more extreme changes in the past, and has not only survived, but has used those changes as opportunities for evolutionary innovation and diversification. The Great Unconformity also provides crucial insights into the connections between geological processes and biological evolution. It shows that the solid Earth and the living world are intimately connected, with changes in one triggering changes in the other. The massive erosion that created the unconformity didn't just remove rock, it also created new habitats, changed ocean chemistry, and provided the nutrients that fueled the evolution of complex life. Understanding these connections is becoming increasingly important as we face the challenges of the Anthropocene, the current geological age dominated by human activities. By studying how Earth's systems responded to the massive changes associated with the Great Unconformity, we can gain insights into how they might respond to the changes we're causing today. But perhaps the most important implication of the Great Unconformity research is what it tells us about the nature of deep time and the importance of thinking on geological timescales. The billion years that disappeared during the formation of the unconformity represent a period longer than the entire history of complex life on Earth. It's a reminder that Earth operates on timescales so vast that they challenge our ability to comprehend them. Yet understanding these timescales is crucial for understanding our planet and our place on it. The Great Unconformity shows that Earth's history is not just a collection of isolated events, but a connected story where processes that began billions of years ago continue to influence the planet today. The missing billion years may be gone forever, but their absence tells a story as powerful and important as any that remains preserved in the rocks. The story ends where it began, with John Wesley Powell standing in the Grand Canyon, staring at that thin line carved across the face of time itself. But now we understand what that line really represents. It's not just a geological curiosity or an academic puzzle, it's a scar, a permanent reminder of the most violent reshaping our planet has ever experienced. Powell couldn't have known, standing there in 1869 with his expedition falling apart around him, that he was looking at evidence of forces beyond imagination. He couldn't have known that the thin line he was sketching in his notebooks represented the destruction of mountain ranges larger than the Himalayas. He couldn't have known that he was documenting the aftermath of a continental breakup so violent it had torn apart an entire supercontinent and carved away 1 billion years of Earth's memory. But in a way, Powell understood something even more important. He understood that the earth beneath his feet was not the stable, unchanging platform that most people imagined. He understood that the rocks were telling a story of unimaginable change, of forces that could lift continents and then tear them down again, of processes that operated on timescales so vast they made human history look like a single heartbeat. That understanding has only grown deeper in the century and a half since Powell's expedition. We now know that the Great Unconformity is not unique to Earth. Similar features have been found on Mars, where ancient impact events and atmospheric changes created their own gaps in the geological record. We found evidence of massive erosion events on other planets and moons, suggesting that the violent reshaping of planetary surfaces may be a common feature of rocky worlds throughout the universe. But Earth's Great Unconformity is special because of what came after. On Mars, the massive erosion events seem to have marked the end of significant geological activity. The planet became a frozen desert, its surface slowly accumulating dust over billions of years. On Earth, the Great Unconformity marked a new beginning. The nutrients released by the erosion of Rodinia didn't just disappear into the oceans, they fueled the evolution of complex life, setting the stage for the Cambrian explosion and everything that followed. The new shallow seas created by continental breakup became evolutionary laboratories where life experimented with new forms and strategies. The changing chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans created new opportunities and new challenges that drove innovation and diversification. In a very real sense, we are the children of the Great Unconformity. The complex life forms that emerged after the breakup of Rodinia include the ancestors of every plant and animal on Earth today. The evolutionary innovations that appeared during the Cambrian explosion, driven by the environmental changes associated with the Great Unconformity, gave rise to all the major groups of complex organisms that we see around us. Every time you look at a tree, you're seeing a descendant of organisms that first learned to photosynthesize efficiently in the nutrient-rich seas created by the erosion of Rodinia. Every time you see a bird or a mammal or a fish, you're seeing a descendant of the first animals that developed complex organs and behaviors in the aftermath of the Great Unconformity. Even the human brain that allows you to read these words and contemplate deep time is ultimately a product of evolutionary processes that began with the breakup of an ancient supercontinent 750 million years ago. But the Great Unconformity has given us more than just our evolutionary heritage. It has also given us the raw materials for civilization itself. Much of the metal ore that we mine from the Earth's crust was concentrated by the massive hydrothermal systems associated with Rodinia's breakup. The sediments eroded from the ancient supercontinent were deposited in basins that later became some of the world's most important oil and gas fields. The mountain ranges created by the reassembly of Rodinia's fragments contain many of the mineral deposits that powered the Industrial Revolution. In a very literal sense, human civilization has been built from the wreckage of Rodinia. The metals in our machines, the energy in our fuel, even the soil in our gardens all trace their origins back to that ancient supercontinent and its violent demise. This connection between deep geological processes and human society is becoming increasingly important as we face the challenges of the 21st century. The Great Unconformity shows us that Earth systems are capable of changes far more extreme than anything in recorded history. It reminds us that what we think of as normal or stable conditions are actually just brief interludes between much more dramatic events. This perspective is particularly relevant for understanding climate change. The breakup of Rodinia triggered climate fluctuations that make current global warming look mild by comparison. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels swung wildly as massive erosion consumed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere while equally massive volcanic eruptions pumped it back in. Global temperatures fluctuated by tens of degrees. Ice caps advanced and retreated across continents multiple times. Yet life not only survived these extreme changes, it used them as opportunities for innovation and diversification. The environmental chaos associated with the Great Unconformity didn't destroy life on Earth. It accelerated evolution and paved the way for unprecedented biological complexity. This doesn't minimize the seriousness of current environmental changes or suggest that humans don't need to worry about their impact on Earth's climate and ecosystems, but it does provide a broader context for understanding the resilience and adaptability of Earth systems. It shows that our planet has weathered far greater storms than the ones it faces today and has emerged stronger and more diverse as a result. The Great Unconformity also provides insights into the timescales on which Earth systems operate and respond to major disruptions. The breakup of Rodinia and the formation of the Great Unconformity took hundreds of millions of years. The recovery of life and the establishment of new ecosystems took additional millions of years. These are not processes that happen quickly by human standards. This has important implications for understanding both the causes and consequences of current environmental changes. Just as the Great Unconformity was the result of processes that began long before its most dramatic effects became apparent, the environmental changes we're seeing today are the result of processes that began with the Industrial Revolution and have been building momentum for over 2 centuries. Similarly, the full consequences of these changes may not become apparent for many decades or even centuries to come. Earth's systems have tremendous inertia, and changes that seem gradual on human timescales can represent dramatic shifts when viewed from a geological perspective. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Great Unconformity is about the nature of permanence and change. The billion years of history that were erased during its formation contained what must have been countless important events, fascinating evolutionary experiments, and unique geological formations. All of that is gone forever, ground up and scattered to the winds by forces beyond the control of any living thing. Yet the absence of those billion years has its own meaning and importance. The Great Unconformity is not just about what was lost, but about what was made possible by that loss. The nutrients released by the erosion of ancient rocks, the new habitats created by changing sea levels, the evolutionary opportunities opened up by environmental chaos, the very processes that destroyed one chapter of Earth's history also wrote the opening lines of the next. This paradox is at the heart of understanding our planet and our place on it. Earth is simultaneously more fragile and more resilient than we often imagine. Individual features of its surface, even mountain ranges and continents, can be erased by geological processes. But the planet as a whole, the integrated system of rock and water and atmosphere and life, has survived and thrived through changes that dwarf anything in human experience. The Great Unconformity reminds us that we are temporary inhabitants of an ancient and dynamic world. The rocks beneath our feet have witnessed the rise and fall of supercontinents, the advance and retreat of ice sheets, the evolution and extinction of countless species. They will continue to witness such changes long after our own species has become part of the fossil record. But our temporary presence on this ancient stage doesn't make us insignificant. If anything, it makes us remarkable. We are the first species in Earth's 4.5 billion year history to become aware of deep time, to read the story written in the rocks, to understand our place in the vast sweep of planetary evolution. We stand today where John Wesley Powell stood in 1869 looking at evidence of processes that operated on timescales almost beyond comprehension. But unlike Powell, we can read the story that the rocks are telling. We can see the Great Unconformity not just as a curious gap in the geological record, but as evidence of our planet's most transformative period, the violent birth of the modern world. The missing billion years are gone forever, but their absence shaped everything that came after, including us. We carry the signature of the Great Unconformity in our DNA, in our fossils, in the very atoms that make up our bodies. We are living evidence of the ancient supercontinent's destruction and the new world that rose from its wreckage. In the end, that may be the most remarkable thing of all about the Great Unconformity. It's not just a hole in time or a gap in the rocks. It's the scar that made complex life possible. It's the destruction that led to creation. It's the billion years that had to disappear so that we could be here to wonder where they went. The prehistoric time hole that no one can explain has become the prehistoric time hole that explains everything. And in understanding it, we understand something fundamental about the nature of our planet and ourselves. We are not separate from the geological forces that shape Earth's surface. We are their creation, their legacy, their living testimony to the power of deep time and planetary change. The great unconformity is our origin story, written in stone.